You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher.
Well, dear mother and father, Ethel, Edie and Basil, this is rather a novelty to come to Australia this way, but here I am, can't see and can't be seen, or welcomed in the usual way with a hug and a kiss.
So we're listening to the voice of an Australian soldier that was recorded, we believe, in about December 1914 in Cairo in Egypt, and he'd gone to a studio and was recording a message home to his family, so his mum and dad and his two sisters and his brother.
Jennifer Selby has listened to this recording countless times. She's an assistant curator in photographs, film and sound, and she played a key role in making this unique artefact available for us all to hear.
The past week, training is getting heavier every day. My word, the Germans or Turks, as we hear, they are making for Egypt. Whatever happens, will stop them from laughing anyhow, when we do start.
Henry Miller Lanser, known as Miller, was born in Sydney in 1890, the eldest of 4 children. As a mechanical engineer, he travelled around New South Wales working on shearing equipment. Miller enlisted in the AIF at the outbreak of the First World War and left for Egypt with the first convoy in October 1914. So how did he go about recording a letter to send home?
That's the question we'd actually all really love to know. I have theories on this. I've looked into this recording over the course of, probably the last 10 years. Setrak Metchian was an Armenian record producer. He had a studio in Cairo, Egypt, and he recorded one-off recordings for musicians and people like that in Egypt. And what I can only assume is that Miller was on leave, wandering around Cairo as the soldiers were doing, playing tourist, and he saw this recording studio and he went in and asked if he could record this letter.
I don't know that I can say a great deal more now, Mother, as this is a time-limited sort of affair, but all I can wish is I hope you all had a real jolly good Christmas. We did, I know. And of course it was rather not the really first time I've been away from Christmas, but I was very anxious to get back to this one. But here I am here now. I'm really enjoying myself, and that's the main thing, and I hope everyone at home are doing the same thing.
The Lanser disc is highly fragile and damaged. It wasn't easy to retrieve the sound of Miller's voice.
If you look at the collection record on our website, you'll see a photograph of the original disc. It's a 10-inch shellac disc and it has a big chunk missing from it. So no, we couldn't actually play the whole recording from that disc. However, something that had come with the donation was the metal master, which was a part of the manufacturing process of the disc. So it is a negative of the record, and we had managed to play back from the negative, taking the sound off the ridges rather than the grooves, the complete recording, and that was the copy of the sound that we had at the time.
This recording is regarded as the oldest in the world of an ordinary soldier during a time of war. What's it like for you to hear his voice? Because he didn't survive the war, did he?
No, he didn't. He was one of our original Anzacs. He landed at Gallipoli on the 25th of April and was wounded. He recovered and went back to Gallipoli and was wounded again at Lone Pine, then eventually rejoined his battalion on the Western Front in 1916, where he was killed by machine gun fire on the 5th of November 1916. So to have this voice of an Australian soldier recorded before the landing at Gallipoli when he was still having a good time exploring foreign parts of the world that he'd never dreamt of seeing, is a really unique thing to have. We have a lot of recordings of First World War soldiers in our collection, but they're oral histories taken maybe in the 1970s or the 1980s, whereas this is a young man sort of at the prime of his life. He was 24 when he enlisted, and we're hearing him before all the events that go on to shape Australians' understanding of military history.
Do we know whether his family got to hear this recording while Henry Lanser was still alive?
We think they probably did. The way he addresses it to them makes it sound like he expects them to be able to hear it. They must have had a gramophone player themselves or access to one, and we do believe that they would have been able to hear the record at the time.
Presumably it would have been a comfort to them, but also something very strange.
Absolutely. I think we're so used to hearing people's voices on the telephone or over video calls these days that it's a lot more commonplace. But in the First World War, it would have been a completely new experience and a real boost for the family. I think they would have been really excited to receive it. And yes, it would have become a completely treasured item after 1916 once he had been killed.
I wish I could go and we could go to the theatre together, something like that. But I can't, you see, I can't leave this instrument. I can't jump out of it. So I think I'll have to close now and wish you goodbye for the time being, anyhow. Well, goodbye, everybody, and good luck.
In the years between the two world wars, technology improved, and it became easier and cheaper to record the human voice.
So during the Second World War, magnetic tape was being developed by Germany, but it didn't come into more use around the world until after the end of the Second World War and into the 50s. But there was still records being made, and they were being made usually with a sort of lacquer over a base, maybe a metal core. During the wartime, metal was scarce, so they replaced that with glass. So you have these lacquer discs with a glass core, and even cardboard records were being made, and these were often made as sort of a one-off novelty type of item, and we have some really beautiful examples of these in our collection.
Hello, Mum and Dad. Day, Rita, Dora and Win.
There were sort of three types of recorded letters that were being made that were being sent back to Australia. We had servicemen, usually Air Force personnel who were on leave from training in Canada, and they'd go down into the United States, and their servicemen's clubs would have these machines set up where you could record a usually no longer than 3-minute message home to your family. And they were sponsored by philanthropic organisations or businesses, and the discs, because they're cardboard, can be quite highly decorated. So they're beautiful to look at as well as to be able to hear a voice.
And you've got an example of one to play for us now. Who's this?
Horace Mervyn Hall, I believe he was known by his middle name Mervyn, and he was in the Air Force and he was on leave in the United States, and he recorded this letter home to his parents and his 4 sisters. And the disc is quite plain. It's just a cardboard disc with the envelope says it's courtesy of the Massachusetts Conference of Christians and Jews, and it's a manufacturer in Chicago. So the postmark on the envelope is from New York, so we do think it was probably recorded in New York, but it might have been Chicago, and it was made in 1943.
What does he talk about?
So he's commenting on what a nice time he's having, how hospitable the people are being, and the Americans are very keen to approach the Australian soldiers and speak to the chaps from the land of the kangaroo. It's he's got a lovely turn of phrase and is quite descriptive, as much as he can be in just a few minutes, about the good time that he's having on leave. Once again, this is before he then heads over to Europe, and actually he's still in a training phase, and it's before he's actually engaged in the air warfare in Europe.
The sound quality is not great, but let's hear a bit more of Mervyn's letter to his family.
People have been wonderfully gracious to us, and their offers of help in regard to billeting and pleasure finding far outweigh our ability to make use of those offers. Also, we are able, through service clubs, to obtain free passes to various shows, so you will see that our time is very much taken up whilst on leave. The people and their customs are tremendously interesting to the boys from down under.
In the following year, 1944, Mervyn was killed in a German attack while piloting a Halifax bomber in a raid over France. His recorded letter was donated to the memorial by a cousin on behalf of his 4 sisters and his son, who was just 2 years old when Mervyn enlisted.
All in the family circle are quite well. Please don't worry about me, dears. I'll be quite okay and patiently waiting for the day when I'll see you all again. Cheerio, and my love to all.
So he was 31 years old when he died, and he's buried in France. And the inscription on his grave there, written by his family, says, "His duty nobly done, too dearly loved, to ever forget." And I feel like this recording remaining in the War Memorials collection and us being able to hear his voice and remember his story means just that. He will never be forgotten.
You're listening to Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. As well as letters recorded by Australian servicemen on leave, the memorial has recordings of World War II POWs. Jennifer says the Japanese military made them as a kind of propaganda.
They would get prisoners to usually, I think, write a message which was then broadcast on their behalf rather than them making the recording themselves. And these were broadcast from Tokyo, from the national broadcaster, and broadcast over shortwave radio bands which were picked up by amateur radio enthusiasts, usually on the west coast of the United States of America. They made sure that the messages included a name and a address or a town in Australia where the prisoners came from. And some of these radio enthusiasts would record the message and put it onto a little cardboard disc and then mail it to the families of the prisoners. So a message that was broadcast from Japan went via the United States where it was recorded and then mailed to a family somewhere in the world and often in Australia. And they're amazingly unique little objects. We have 3 discs now from the one person, B.O. South in San Francisco, who obviously was in the habit of making these recordings and sending them to Australia. And yes, we now have 3 that have come from this person in our collection.
What an amazing thing for him to do, to provide such comfort to the families. But I wonder why the Japanese were doing it. Was it to really personalise it? You say it's propaganda, but to say, look, we have got your boys and we've got this one in particular.
I think it was a way of making the Allied forces hear that they were safe and well. We all know now the conditions that prisoners of the Japanese endured in their captivity, and often they were not at all safe or well. But in these messages, they're always saying that, oh yes, we're all right, and this person's all right, and I can't wait to see you. So I think that was sort of the idea behind the propaganda, perhaps.
The quality of these recordings is not great, Jen, but we can make out a few phrases.
That's right. I think because they were broadcast, they were picked up in the United States. We're not sure if they were able to record them directly to the little cardboard discs or if they actually had to use a wire recorder first and then transfer it again. And then, of course, these discs were only made to last a few plays, being cardboard, and are very subject to cracking and warping and, are very fragile. And these days, the sound quality that we can get off them often has a lot of surface noise and, is quite muddy. But it's amazing that they've lasted all these years.
Do not be concerned or over anxious about us. Our main round is for you at home.
This message from Private Bill Cameron was broadcast on Radio Tokyo in May 1945 during a program called Postman Calling. It was addressed to his mother in Tasmania. Bill had been captured in Timor in 1942 and slaved on the Burma-Thailand Railway as well as in mines in Japan. He survived the war.
This hoping will soon meet again. God bless you, Mom and all. Your loving son, Bill.
Lance Sergeant John Down also survived the war. He was captured by the Japanese after the fall of Singapore, and his letter was also addressed to his mother.
Dear Nathan, my health is excellent. Love to family, Peg and Eben. Hope happy ending too. Jack Bealey of Maruga, Herc Nicholas of Croydon, Jim McKinnon, Huntsville, Jack McKinnon, Armadale, here and all around. Your loving son, John.
Another example of recorded letters, or messages really, were those that were made to be broadcast on radio programs in Australia. In some situations, soldiers, airmen or sailors were professionally recorded while on active duty.
That's right. So another sort of recorded letter made during the Second World War were made by ABC field teams who were travelling all around the conflict areas where Australians were fighting and recording for a program called Voices from Overseas. And they recorded short messages from soldiers and sailors, usually it seems, and they were broadcast on the radio, usually more than once because they were popular segments. And once these recordings were made and they were back in Australia, the ABC passed the recordings on to the Red Cross to be made into discs that families could purchase, and it was a fundraising exercise for the Red Cross. So families could go to the Maher Emporium and order a disc of one of these messages from someone that they knew, and they were printed out on little 7-inch lacquer discs. They have a metal core, so they're very fragile. Yeah, we have a few of these that have survived the years and have been donated and are in our collection now.
Including a young man called Pat from Western Australia.
That's right. So stoker Patrick John Kelly was a sailor on board HMAS Perth when the ABC Field Recording Unit came aboard the ship in 1941.
Hello, Western Australia. Here we are on the deck of a cruiser somewhere in the Middle East. I may not tell you exactly where. And around me are a whole lot of very fine Australian boys. And here's a couple of Western Australians who are just going to say cheery ho to some of their folks at home.
Hello, Western Australia. This is Pat of Mylands, or Patrick John Pulley, representing 44 Miss. Hello, Mum, Dad, Jean, Perth, Rosie. How are you? We're doing all right over here, and our chins are up, so don't worry. Harry wishes to be remembered to his people in Mount Lawley, Mum and Dad and 2 sisters. And Ron wishes to be remembered to his folks in Victoria Park. And Jack sends his love to his family in Subiaco. We're all hale and hearty and in the pink, so everything's right. So au revoir till we see you. Goodbye.
So HMAS Perth saw heavy action all around the Mediterranean, around Greece and Crete and Syria, and then they moved back down into the Pacific region. And on the 1st of March 1942, the ship was sunk during the Battle of the Sunda Strait, sunk in a battle with the Japanese. 357 of the crew were killed in that incident.
Stoker Pat Kelly was among the dead.
I think in total, covering all conflicts, around 100 recorded letters, and it does seem like, particularly from the Second World War letters, the ones that have survived time and been treasured by families perhaps and thought worthy of being offered to the War Memorial for donation seem quite often to be of men who did not survive the war. We do have letters, recorded letters from people who returned and went on to live long and healthy lives, but it does seem like quite a number of them are of men who didn't survive the war.
One man who did survive his war was another Mervyn, and this Merv served in the Vietnam War. And his letter is very different from the ones that we've heard so far. He had a lot of tape and a lot of time on his hands. Tell us about this.
That's right. So Private Kenneth Mervyn Haynes, who again was known by the name Mervyn, recorded a reel-to-reel letter for his family. So a 3-inch magnetic tape reel that could hold about 20 minutes worth of audio, so considerably more than the 1 or 2 minutes recorded in the Second World War, and those, keeping in mind those recordings were made publicly with an announcer or other men gathered around the microphone. This was recorded in his tent at his base at the Horseshoe in Phuoc Toi province in Vietnam, and it really is a stream of consciousness, almost a conversation with his sister and his brother-in-law, with other mentions of his family, obviously on the understanding that the tape would be circulated amongst his family back in Australia.
Well, hi Alan and Russell. I hope this is the tape you want. I got it last time I was down RMC a couple of days ago. I got an opportunity tonight, Saturday night off, the other half of the course on out ambushing, and we got the night off, so I thought I'd sit down here and chat into this so you could all have a bit of a listen. I wrote to Mum today and told her that I was going to do this and that you could send it up to her after you get it. So if I know how long this is going to last for and how long I'm going to talk for, or what I'm going to talk about. I hope you're all well over there, especially you, Alan, seeing you've got the baby well on the way by now. I hope everything goes just great for you.
He talks about all sorts of things, and we'll hear some of that, but at times he's struggling to fill up the tape, isn't he? He thinks he's got this opportunity and he should make the most of it.
That's right. He acknowledges sort of the difficulties he's having, that it feels quite unnatural to be sitting there just talking into the recorder, and how he's rewinding and listening to parts again to hear that it's coming out okay. And I think by the end of the second side, it feels like it's dragging for him to fill up the 20 minutes.
I don't really mind the rain. Actually, sometimes you sleep quite well when you're wet. But the main nuisance, of course, is mosquitoes. They hang around you in droves all night. You got the mosquito repellents fair enough on your face and hands, but things bite right through your sleeves. Well, not your sleeves, but on your back of your shirts and back of your legs, where your clothes seem to pull tight over your skin. Usually just, I always sleep in a silk. Seems to keep a lot of them off, but when you're doing the pickets during the night, usually do about 2 hours pickets. Well, we have 2 groups in the ambush, 2 gun pits. Usually end up doing about 2 hours each night. And that's, they seem to bite the most. But now the wet's over, I suppose it'll take a fair while for these mozzies to die down again. But, so they're so strict over here on the malaria precautions. Well, I'm not doing too bad. I've done one side, see how we go on this side. What shall I talk about now?
Recorded letters are so incredibly personal and so important, because we have lots of written diaries, we have lots of written letters, and they're amazing private insights into soldiers' thoughts and feelings at the time. With our sound collection, usually recordings are made many years after the fact as an oral history recording, maybe covering their entire life, their entire service, and, over a number of hours, and maybe often when they're a lot older. So for a recorded letter to be made in the field at the time that they are serving, you get quite a special insight into what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they're doing, and so much of it is about how much they're missing their family and thinking of them, and this is a way that they're showing their love and that they're in their thoughts, and they send the message home to their family.
Merv Haynes was wounded in action just days after this letter was recorded, but he stayed in Vietnam until his battalion returned to Australia 3 months later. After talking to his family for nearly 22 minutes, the tape ran out just as he was sending his love.
Thank you once all again for all the letters, everything you've done for me. Especially thanks for you, Mum. I know I've given you quite a few jobs and that to do. But they are really greatly appreciated. I think a lot of the things been quite hard to do without you. Really do appreciate this, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all when I get home next March. That's just about it. The tape's just about out. Loved it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. You can subscribe to the series by going to the Memorial's website or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.